Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling one of aviation's most perplexing, tragic, and honestly, fiercely debated mysteries. I'm going to walk you through a giant puzzle where the exact same pieces of evidence led two different nations to two completely opposite conclusions. It's a story about raw data, human nature, and the incredibly complicated search for truth at 33,000 feet. Let's get right into it. The stark reality of this tragedy starts right here. Picture this. It's the night of October 31st, 1999. You've got 217 people, tourists on an elder hostel trip, a super experienced flight crew, and 33 Egyptian military officers, all boarding a Boeing 767 in New York, heading for Cairo. But just 30 minutes after takeoff, the unthinkable happens. The lives of everyone on board are tragically cut short as the aircraft plunges into the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. Part 1. Disaster over the Atlantic. The final 30 minutes. Okay, so let's break down this timeline, because things happen fast. On a long 10-hour flight like this, it's totally standard practice to have a relief crew. But roughly 20 minutes after takeoff, the relief first officer, 59-year-old Gamal El-Batouti, comes into the cockpit way earlier than expected, and he insists on taking over from the younger co-pilot. Now, shortly after the command captain, Ahmed El-Abashi, steps out to use the restroom, the autopilot suddenly disconnects. Out of nowhere, the aircraft pitches down into a terrifying dive, dropping so steeply that the passengers and crew are literally subjected to zero gravity. Just 16 seconds into this weightless, totally chaotic freefall, Captain El-Abashi somehow forces his way back into the cockpit to fight for control of the plane. During this dive, the plane exceeds its maximum design speeds, eventually loses an engine, and just minutes later, it disappears from radar entirely. The final moments recorded inside that cockpit are just harrowing. As the plane plunged, setting off this deafening chaos of warning alarms, the captain was fighting desperately to save the aircraft. He shouted, "What's happening?" And then, "Pull with me! You shut off the engine! Pull!" But despite his desperate physical struggle against the diving aircraft and those confused pleas to his first officer, he just couldn't stop the inevitable. Part 2. Recovering the evidence. Raising the black boxes. So the wreckage was located in water over 200 feet deep, roughly 60 miles off the American coast. The U.S. Navy brought in an unmanned submarine called Deep Drone to pull up the flight data and cockpit voice recorders. And when investigators finally translated the Arabic audio, well, they found the central puzzle of the entire tragedy. As the plane was diving, First Officer El-Batouti never once answered the captain's frantic questions. Instead, he just repeatedly uttered a single phrase. He said, "Tawakkalt al-Allah," which translates to, "I rely on God." He said it 11 times. And what's truly fascinating and tragic about this is how this single piece of audio instantly split the investigation right down the middle, sending Egyptian and American investigators down two completely different paths. Part 3. Theory 1. Mechanical failure. The Egyptian conclusion. Now, to understand the Egyptian argument, you really have to grasp this specific mechanical event: an elevator hardover. The elevators are those panels on the tail of the plane that pitch the nose up or down. A hardover means these controls essentially jammed and locked in a downward position. So the Egyptian civil aviation experts argued that a mechanical failure caused this exact hardover, forcing the plane into a steep dive that the pilots physically could not overcome. It didn't matter how hard they pulled back on the yokes, the plane was locked going down. And you have to admit, this is a compelling theory because they actually found physical evidence to back it up. While examining the wreckage, investigators found sheared rivets in the elevator assembly, and it gets crazier. When the FAA inspected Boeing 767s worldwide because of this, they actually found 136 sheared rivets in other planes. That discovery literally led to the temporary grounding of 34 aircraft. So, for the Egyptian team, the timeline made perfect sense under this theory. They argued El-Batouti disconnected the autopilot because he was reacting to a sudden, unusual movement. The flight data showed the captain pulling up while the first officer was pushing down. But the Egyptian expert said no, this wasn't a fight between the pilots. Their controls were mechanically split, and they were desperately fighting a severe jam together. They even explained shutting off the engines as a standard emergency procedure in response to a low oil pressure warning that flashed during the dive. Furthermore, Egyptian investigators completely rejected the idea that El-Batouti's repeated words were some kind of suicide note. Cultural experts, like Arabic professor Amin Bana, pointed out that tawakkalt ala Allah is actually a deeply positive, everyday phrase. It's something you might say when starting a drive or beginning a long journey. The argument was that in Egyptian culture, a religious family man would absolutely not use this specific phrase right before committing mass murder. Part 4. Theory 2. Intentional action. The American conclusion. Just look at this stark divide. It's like they were looking at two totally different flights. Where the Egyptian team saw El Batouti disconnecting the autopilot to save the plane, the NTSB concluded he disconnected it to manually force the plane down. Where the Egyptian team saw two pilots working together to fight a mechanical jam, the NTSB saw a terrifying physical struggle, the captain pulling up and the first officer deliberately pushing the nose down. And the engines? Well, the NTSB argued there is absolutely no emergency scenario over the ocean at night where shutting off all engine power makes any sense. They concluded it was a deliberate act to guarantee the plane couldn't recover. This is where the FBI was brought in to investigate the human element, specifically focusing on First Officer Gamil El Batouti, and they uncovered a pretty troubled background. He was 59, nearing retirement, but had never been promoted past First Officer. On top of that, the FBI found multiple reports of alleged sexual misconduct involving hotel maids and guests at the Hotel Pennsylvania in New York, which is where the crew stayed. Crucially, a defecting Egyptair pilot told the FBI that the airline's chief pilot, Hatem Rushdie, who, by the way, was actually a passenger on Flight 990, had severely reprimanded El Batouti at the hotel the very night before the crash. Rushdie allegedly told him his behavior could no longer be covered up and that this trip would be his absolute last flight to the United States. So the FBI began to suspect revenge as a possible motive. To test the mechanical failure theory, NTSB investigators ran the flight data through highly advanced flight simulators. And according to Bernard Loeb, the former director of aviation safety at the NTSB, the data was irrefutable. They concluded that absolutely no Boeing 767 elevator failure could make the plane perform those exact maneuvers. For the American investigators, the aerodynamics pointed definitively to one thing: intentional, manual flight control inputs by the first officer. Part 5. An unresolved tragedy. Two nations divided. So, after more than 2 years and a $10 million investigation, the two sides reached a permanent stalemate. The NTSB published its final report declaring the crash was the result of the first officer's intentional actions. The Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority responded with intense anger. They published their own official conclusion stating a mechanical defect was to blame, and they publicly accused the United States of a cover-up to protect Boeing's reputation. And the reality is, neither side ever backed down. Which leaves us with this haunting question. Will we ever truly know what happened in the darkness at 33,000 feet? This whole case is a powerful reminder of how raw data, cultural context, and human behavior can be interpreted in vastly different ways depending on who is looking at it. But at the heart of this geopolitical stalemate are the families of the 217 passengers and crew. For them, these opposing reports offer very little comfort, and the exact truth of what occurred in that cockpit may forever remain a painful, lingering mystery. So what do you think really happened? Thank you for joining me to explore this incredibly complex and tragic case. We'll see you next time.